Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Wow, I'm pretty sure I'm going to hit pay dirt out here on Oak Island. Treasure hunters been trying to find a motherlode buried by the Knights Templar for several centuries.
Well, that's true, Tim, but why do you think that you're going to go and do better than the pros with their advanced magnetic resonance and their high-tech drilling equipment?
Well, I have the best damn dowsing rods known to man. 2 wire coat hangers.
Well, they do look like they're moving by themselves over something. What have you got there?
Well, I'm hoping. It's probably. Geez, it has to be the Holy Grail.
Still looks suspicious to me.
Well, we'll have to check it out further. Get down on your knees, Tim, and help me dig a little here in the mud.
All right.
There you go. There you go. Oh boy. Well, we're knee deep in the mildew once again. Or something to that effect. At least you are, I know, out in Jasper, Indiana. Here in New York, we're in the middle of the concrete jungle, and there's more concrete here than you could shake a flying saucer at. Every day I go out, there's a bigger crane on the block. This weekend, I had to walk 2 blocks out of my way to get back to my building because they had this crane that must have been the equivalent of like maybe 25 stories tall. And I asked the guy, I said, the head foreman there, why do you have to do this on the weekend when the few people that live on the block might like a little leisure time to themselves? And he said, oh, that's the only time that the city will give us a permit. So, the restaurant here is going to get fewer customers, and we just have to worry about even my my relatives and all coming. They can't park anywhere near here, so I end up spending $50 on a garage. I feel like taking that crane and I won't talk like that. I know this is a sort of family show.
Well, can't you just swing into your apartment window from the building next door?
Well, it's too high up to do that, to be honest with you. It's just unreal. I think I posted a photo on Facebook, or meant to anyway, of the crane. Well, we just did it kind of ties in with this book we just did, the Weird Winged Wonders, the Twilight World of Cryptoid Creatures. I guess we had a few big cranes in there, right?
Maybe a different kind of crane.
Yeah. We'll see. I got to get a little promotion in anyway. Hey,
and I should just add, now out, available on Amazon.
That's right. Just for the last couple of days. Mm-hmm. And I do want to get on to our guest, but I do also want to tell our listeners that we have a very special announcement after the first break about a screening of a UFO type film coming up that you are free to attend in Jersey City next week. But Tim, let us bring on our guest and discuss our topic for the evening.
Oh, yeah. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about dowsing and radionics and pendulum, and as some people like to refer to it, water witching and other things. But I don't know. That may be a stereotype anymore, Tim. So we'll leave it up to our guest to decide whether or not that's the case or not. But speaking of our guest, I'm really happy that we have Jim Willis back on with us again. Now, I think this is the third time Jim has been with us on Exploring the Bizarre. And if anybody remembers, now Jim earned his master's degree in theology from Andover Newton Theological School. Jim has been an ordained minister for over 40 years, and he has also taught college courses in comparative religion and cross-cultural studies. His background in theology and education led to his writings on religion, the apocalypse, cross-cultural spirituality, and the mysteries of the unknown. Now, he has written a number of just really fascinating books. The ones that I have gotten, I've just really enjoyed all of them. One of them is The Dragon Awakes, Rediscovering Earth Energy in the Age of Science, Ancient Gods, Lost Histories, Hidden Truths, and the Conspiracy of Science. And I can't, I have to talk about this. His to be released, I don't think he has a date quite yet for it, is a Quantum Dowsing, a new understanding of the ancient craft. So also with us tonight is Ed Kelly of Kelly Research Technologies. And I'm really happy that Ed agreed to be with us tonight. Now, Ed, along with his sister, runs Kelly Research Technologies in Lamont, Georgia. Now, Kelly Research Technologies is a second-generation family business dedicated to manufacture and distribution of top-quality scalar and phase I'm not going to pronounce that correctly. Conjunct technology for use of the vast community of radionic, psychotronic, and other subtle energies. Now, I should point out that it was originally organized under the names Interdimensional Sciences Incorporated and Dimensional Sciences Incorporated from Ed's father, inventor Peter J. Kelly, who designed, manufactured, and distributed variable capacitor scalar tuning devices, as well as a family of related devices. Now, Ed and his sister have been running Kelly Research Technology since 2004, and it's dedicated to further distribution of the products and devices developed by their father, as well as support of all existing customers and clients of interdimensional sciences and dimensional sciences. So, Jim, Ed, thank you very much for being with us tonight on Exploring the Bizarre.
Well, you know, I never realized, Tim, that there are various aspects to dowsing. Now, I see, and I may be wrong here, that Jim approaches it from a more conventional point of view, where I think with Ed, are we not talking about radionics and the Hieronymus machine?
Yes, exactly. Which I mean, the radionics and Hieronymus devices are really a kind of a modern electronic mechanical versions of dowsing. I mean, they all seem to kind of hail from the same family tree.
Well, I'm going to dig into this, and I'm sure you are too. But Jim, where are we talking to you?
I'm in South Carolina.
South Carolina.
Yeah, as a matter of
fact, dowsing going on down there?
I've just discovered I'm only about 4 hours from Ed, and before this is over, I'm going to make an appointment to get out there and see him sometime. I really
my goodness, you know, one thing that we have been able to do here or accomplish over the last several seasons, and Peter tells us that this is our 125th episode, is get a lot of our guests together. That's one of the reasons that we try to pair up two guests to a program. But Jim, let's start off simple for those who have absolutely no background in dowsing. What exactly is dowsing?
Wow. I'll try to stick to the 5 or 10 minute version, and I'll try not to fall into my 2-hour seminar. Dowsing, I can probably best explain it by telling you how I got into it. Basically, dowsing is the idea picture a radio, for instance, or a television set, say. If you had the old-fashioned television set, black and white television with the rabbit ears on top, I'm dating myself now, you would watch that television and maybe pick up the rabbit ears. We used to do this when we were kids, and moving them around, and you'd see the picture change on the television set. And if you stood in one place, you'd get a better picture, and then you'd move over across the room. And what that was telling you was that there were all kinds of television signals going through the room, coursing through your body all the time, and you're just not aware of them until you started picking up those rabbit ears, and you became an antenna for the television set. And that made, all of a sudden, it made it very clear to you that these television waves, which were all over the place, and you were experiencing them all the time, on the television, you could see the results of that experience. And that is kind of what dowsing is. The rabbit ears were dowsing rods. Whether you use a pendulum or whether, in my case, usually I'm using what we call L rods. They're two rods, one held in each hand, and they are shaped in the letter L, a lot like the letter L, and so you hold them, and you can all of a sudden, by asking questions and by fully intentionally getting into the proper wavelengths, the rods will all of a sudden move, and they will become a visible sign of something that your body has been experiencing, but it was below the level of your understanding. You didn't realize they were there until all of a sudden these dowsing rods move. When it happens for the first time in your life, it will change your life forever, because it doesn't seem possible. You begin to wonder how it could be. I'll never forget the first time I tried dowsing. I never believed in dowsing. I never thought there was anything to it at all, and I matter of fact, looked down on people who were dowsing. I thought they were quacks. I thought there was something going on. But for some reason, when we moved out here to the woods in South Carolina almost a decade ago now, one morning I got up and said I wanted to learn how to douse for water. And so I went down to my local hardware store, and believe it or not, they didn't actually have any dowsing rods in the hardware store. So I tried to get some brass rods. Well, they didn't have any of that either, but I could get some really thick, heavy-duty copper wire. So I cut two lengths of them off, bent them into L rods, and I went out armed with my dowsing rods, not knowing what I was doing, to try to find water. And I totally struck out. Didn't find anything. I even walked across the water line that runs between the well and the house where I knew there was water, and nothing happened. So I did what we all do nowadays. I went on the internet and looked at, if you look up dowsing on the internet, you'll just find thousands and thousands of pages. And one page caught my eye, and it was about dowsing for earth energy. And that sounded really interesting to me. So after reading some more, I took the dowsing rods. I went out in the front yard, and I just tried to really intentionally focus, meditative kind of focus on earth energy. Were there any of these subtle energies moving through the earth around me? And at one point right in our front yard, I took the step that changed me forever. 1 minute, the rods were just sitting there inert. And the next minute, I took one step and they crossed. It was like I was running into a wall. And I backed off and did it again. Same place, same thing happened. And basically what I had discovered was what we might call a river of energy. It used to be called, in this case, used to be called a ley line, but we don't use that term much anymore, but an energy line that was actually flowing through the earth. Wherever I hit it, the rods would simply collapse when I entered into it. I would come in from the other side, and they would do the same thing on the other side. It was as if there was a river of energy, happened to be 86.5 inches wide. And I was so fascinated that I followed this river in the backyard and the front yard. I followed this particular energy line out as far as, well, in one case, probably more than 50 miles. And it took a while to find it. But when I found it, there it was again. Same energy line. I could actually put it on a map. And when I began to research all these and put them all on a map and see where they went, it's very difficult to draw a line over the Earth on a flat map. But there seems to be an energy line that flows right through our house that we built our house on without realizing what we were doing, that flows all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and happens to go through an unbelievable number of American Indian special sites of the Mound people, even the Georgia Guidestones up in Georgia. And no matter how far out I found it, there it is, the same energy line. Since then, of course, that kind of opened the thing. I've learned that you can dowse for absolutely anything, by focusing in on it. But
we heard that Uri Geller became a millionaire because he was flying over. I think it was maybe South Africa with a map and pointed out the location of an oil field.
Wow, I don't doubt it.
And got a finder's fee, which he certainly well deserved. Now, correct me if I'm incorrect, but doesn't dowsing go back several thousand years to China, where they called it the dragon lines?
Yes, it goes back, as far as we can tell, it goes way, way back, thousands of years. As a matter of fact, dowsing, the world of dowsers, you can even see it in the Old Testament, for instance, when Moses goes out into the desert carrying his rod, and what does he do? He finds water. I think there's a perfect example of dowsing right there. I think the neat thing about, and I hope to get into this with Ed a little bit later, but the neat thing about what Ed and his company are doing is they are coming at this now from the hard science side. And so what we're actually having in our generation, I never thought I would live to see this. In our generation, we have the dowsing world, thousands of years old, which has been up until now seen as a kind of a parapsychology or something like that, metaphysical. And now the scientific world, especially through quantum studies, are starting to merge together. And so the two lanes of traffic, which have been going sideways with each other, parallel to each other, the science and the intuitive, the mystic, are now merged onto one super highway. And I think in the next 20, 30 years, we're going to see a change like you've never seen before.
So, Jim, when you were out in your yard and discovered the Earth energy line, now how could you tell the difference between something like that or underground water, or even just say a pipe underneath your feet?
At first, I couldn't. I didn't know how to do it. But as you practice and practice and practice and learn this whole idea of intention, it seems like now, when I'm looking for earth energy, I can walk right over a stream and the dowsing rods won't do anything. If I'm looking for water, I can walk right across an energy line and the water will show and the energy line won't. It's really funny. The electric crew was coming up and paving our road. We're way out in the woods, and they were paving the road for the first time, and they knew there was a water line that ran, a private water line that ran along the side of the road, and they couldn't find it. And they also knew that there was an electric line underneath. Now, they could find the electric line, but they couldn't find the water line. So I went out, and I was going to be the big hero, and I walked out and I said, you want me to find that water line for you? I'll go get my dowsing rods. And I didn't know what kind of reaction I was going to get. The head of the crew said, oh, don't worry, I got mine in the truck. He went and got his own dowsing rods, came out, and came within just a matter of feet. He says, I know the water is right here someplace because I'm getting a thing. I got my dowsing rods, and between the two of them, we were able to pinpoint not only the exact place where the water was, but how deep it was. And here was this guy from the electric company using, with all of his high-tech equipment available, using dowsing rods to find water. And the electric line didn't even bother us. When we decided to dowse for the electric line, then we could find it. Our minds were intent on it. And then the water wasn't registering. But when we were looking for that water line, there it was. It was an amazing day. I really enjoyed that afternoon.
So now, is there a way that you can tell how deep this water or the pipe is?
Yeah, you use what we call bracketing.
Mhm.
And here's where it begins to sound really deep physical. I mean, way off the charts and everything else. But you can actually stand on a water source, and you can say, "How deep is this water source?" And you can ask the question, "Is this water source more than 10 feet deep?" And in my case, the rods will just sit there and they won't move. And if I can say, "Are they less than 10 feet deep?" and the rods will move. I can say, "Is it more than 5 feet deep?" And by changing around more than 5, less than 10, you can actually measure exactly how deep the water is. When I first heard about this, I didn't believe it. So I went out to my well, and I didn't remember how deep the well was at all, but I wanted to know if I could figure it out. So I dowsed, and through this bracketing, how deep is it and how shallow is everything else, I managed to come up with a number, a very specific number. And I brought that number in, and we went back into the records of when the well company was there, and on the bill, it said exactly how deep they had gone, and I was within about a foot of it. And that really got through to me. Apparently, when we're doing this kind of thing, our bodies are aware of this, but they're aware of it at a level that is below the level of our 5 senses. And when we have these dowsing rods in our hand, all of a sudden, they show us that we're feeling and experiencing subtle energies that we're not even aware of.
It's funny that you talk about the people with the electric company with their own dowsing rods, because and I've talked about this on the show before. One day from my office window, I could see people from the local water company looking for buried pipe in my neighbor's yard, and they brought out all kinds of metal detectors and other types of probably magnetic resonance machines and things, trying to find this. Yeah. And you could tell that they were struggling. Well, then a guy got it. He got into the back of the car, brought out this box, and brought out L rods, and I knew exactly what he was going to do. And then pretty soon, he's walking back and forth across with these L rods, and they started crossing, and he did put a marker here and a marker there, and pretty soon he had it exactly where this water pipe was, and they dug, and sure enough, that's where it was. So, I mean, I was just, I found it just very humorous myself, because, I mean, here they had all this fancy equipment, yet they were able to bring out L rods and just almost immediately locate this pipe. Well, Jim, we're going to have to go to our break in just about a few seconds. So when we come back, we'll bring Ed Kelly into the conversation. So you're listening to Exploring the Bizarre, so stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Wow.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. And we're up to a great start here, Tim. And I tell you, I have been fascinated by dowsing. For just years and years. And what's really interesting to me is all the different kinds of devices that people can use to douse. Like the L rods, like Jim was talking about. The traditional fork stick. I mean, there are people who use pliers, pendulums. Little things called doodlebugs. And now, I mean, we're getting into radionics and psychotronics, like that our guest Ed Kelly is going to talk about.
Well, this is radionics, and I know Ed knows about the Hieronymus machine. Now, I used to listen when I was a kid, and later on I was on the show. Long John Nebel had a program that was on nightly, 6 days a week, 7 days a week actually, from midnight till 5 o'clock in the morning. And he had on some of the strangest guests possible. And he used to have on Joseph Campbell was a regular. Now, Joseph Campbell was editor, and maybe you can help me out here, was it Galaxy magazine?
Oh boy, you put me on the spot here, Tim.
Well, it was a little digest magazine, and it was mainly science fiction. So I often wondered, well, why was he so fascinated with the Hieronymus machine, which seemed really quirky to me. I mean, you could put somebody's hair or a toenail or fingernail or something like that in the on top of the machine, and it will tell you about the health of the person whose specimen you have. Now, maybe if you have DNA today, you can tell some of the same things, but we're talking about, well, maybe it is DNA. Maybe it was the same connection. But that always seemed rather peculiar to me, and I need an explanation. But, I want to mention that we have a program coming up. Is it next week, Tim, where David Huggins is going to be on the show?
No, it's going to be March 22nd.
March 22nd. Okay.
March 22nd.
Anyway, on the 23rd of February, our longtime friend, Carla Anderson, who was a previous co-host of a prior program, she runs a hair salon called Balance, which is located at 253 2nd Street in Jersey City, New Jersey. Very easy to get to. Well, the decor and the design of the hair salon is very specific. It is of a mothership. In fact, I do believe at one point she was doing crop circle haircuts. And anyway, on the 23rd, Carla will have a special screening and a art gallery display by David Huggins. Now, what makes David so unusual in this world of extraterrestrials that David claims at the age of 17 he lost his virginity to an extraterrestrial, and ever since then, up until a couple of years ago, he has been having sexual relations with one or more alien women, females, let's put it that way, who he meets when the wall to his apartment opens and he is able to enter into another dimension. Now, I know this all sounds very peculiar, very bizarre, and totally off the wall. And I agree. I certainly are skeptical about some of the things that we discuss, and this would be one of them. But David is a fascinating individual, and Paula Harris, who has credentials, has written a book about David's experiences, and there is a movie called Love and Saucers, which will be screened on the 23rd at Balance at 8 o'clock. And again, the address there is 353 2nd Street in Jersey City. And you can meet David in person. You can see his paintings, which are very spectacular and certainly bizarre even by our standards. And you will be able to see the movie, no charge or for any of it. But you might want to make an appointment to get your hair done at some point in the future, because it certainly is a time warp at Balance. So I will be there. I mean, I show up at very few public places, but I'm not going to miss being at the Carla's, because she always puts on a great event, and David certainly is a masterful artist and creator of the unknown. So I just want to let people know about this and hope to see you there. Anyway, Tim, why don't you carry on with the conversation and maybe get Ed to talk a little about radionics?
Well, sure. Well, Ed, thanks again for being with us tonight on Exploring the Bizarre. So what is radionics?
What is radionics? That's always the great question.
Yeah, that's right. Good way to start.
For the opportunity to be on the show, Tim and Timothy and Jim. I was so fascinated to listen to what you were saying, because if you could have seen me through the phone here, I was just nodding along the whole way. There is no radionics without dowsing. And the fact of the matter is that, just going about daily life, you will more often find me with a pendulum in my pocket than with my hands on a radionic instrument. They both are, they really are looking at the exact same phenomena, but with different octaves of activity. Whereas with dowsing, you're participating directly in the subtle energy fields, using that focused intent to zoom in and gather information about things in the future, things in the past, or things right in the present. And anything from physical things like a river under the ground to ideas and intentions, how to pursue and how to stay out of trouble and find opportunity. With radionics, the big difference there is a radionic instrument, the way we do it, it's been around for a little over 100 years now. First discovered by a medical doctor named Albert Abrams, who was a professor on the staff at Stanford University in California at the time that he first noticed that he could hold a wire, literally hold a wire to the skin of a student that was brought in, and then behind a screen have a nurse lower the other end of that wire into samples of different types of diseased tissue. And then in those days, the percussive thing that they still do to this day where they kind of thump on your belly to see whether your liver is healthy and that sort of thing. That was a bigger part of the diagnosis process in those days. And he found that he would detect the response of a cancer or other disease on the skin of the student, even though the tissue was at the other end of a wire. And luckily, he was independently wealthy and could afford to have the very first radionic instruments built to plunge into that world a lot deeper. And where we come from at KRT, Kelly Research Technologies, we're really students of the Hieronymus school, which Hieronymus is most famous in the radionic circles for being the only person in the United States to be issued a patent for a radionic instrument in 1949. And in the early 50s, he had a long dialogue through the mail with Joseph Campbell, the publisher and author. And at that time, it was almost very early crowdsourcing of discussion as Joseph Campbell published the plans and the schematics so that all the engineers out there could build their own instruments, and then they could have a big discussion over a number of years to follow. And my father had discovered radionics in the early 1970s, and then actually met Hieronymus, who was an old man by this point, in the early at the very first U.S. Psychotronics Association meeting in 1974. And my father had been building his own instruments for his own amusement and then for those of his friends in his own research. And then by 1978, we were getting calls from total strangers. And so we never intended to be in the radionics business, but this year is actually our 40th anniversary of selling that first instrument to a stranger.
Wow.
And the way it's done now is they really are low-powered AM radios with a series of coils and variable plate capacitors, which are the same old-school tuning devices that you would find in any pre-digital radio, whether that was a car or a hi-fi set. And as you tune those little tuners on the inside, they spontaneously resonate as they come into resonance with either an idea that the operator is focusing on or just the natural subtle energy field emanations that are picked up in the sample well, which are sort of like a pickup coil for the radio. And the magical part, really the only magical part of it, is the antenna, where you can make a broadcast over unlimited distance and time back to the farmer's field or back to your cat in South Carolina or wherever you want to go.
Well, now I'm sorry. Yeah, finish your sentence.
Well, that's really it. So, on a practical basis, what you can do is you can indeed put a sample in the well, and I think you really hit on it. I really do believe, I can't prove this in any way, but I really do believe it's the DNA that captures the structure and captures that inherent blueprint that says these are the vibratory patterns that ought to be found in this, whether it's a seed corn or a hair on an animal or even just off a mineral, something that's not particularly organic. And then we can tune into known radio frequencies or cold scan, dowse basically for unknown radio frequencies, and then use a volume knob, essentially, to make comparisons about which fields are stronger, which ones are weaker, and so that we can then either take action here in the physical realm, the physical octave, like the farmer might realize that the field is low in calcium and go out and spread some calcium, or turn that amplifier on and move it into the broadcast mode and broadcast the energy pattern for calcium back to the field directly. And that's really it. It's really, there's a lot of mumbo jumbo that gets thrown around about the instruments, but they really are just low-powered AM radios and ours operate in the shortwave band, and then you just have that magic antenna that produces the scalar field to go back across the ether.
Well, okay, now that's to me that one of the interesting things, and you touched on this a little bit. I mean, a lot of people who are familiar with radionic machines think of them only as being used to diagnose and treat illnesses. Yet, and I know that Bob Hieronymus was really very interested in this, but they can also be used, especially in agriculture, in finding out problems, or even diagnoses and taking care of insect infestations.
That's absolutely true. They really are. It's interesting. Our client base is a mix. It's pretty well split 50-50 between commercial farmers who are looking to find ways to move forward, usually in an organic environment, where they don't want to use kilocides and chemicals. And then on the other side, you have, sort of the new age spiritual, that kind of exploration where they want to do analysis of their animals. But it's the same with the farmers as well. It's livestock guys. I just did a workshop in Iowa this weekend where we had two fellows that came all the way from Australia. With one of them is 60,000 cherry trees. That's why he was there, was to see what he could do with his cherry trees.
That's extremely fascinating, and I have to tell you that when I used to live in Indianapolis, I used to go to a chiropractor who used a radionics machine, and he'd set you down at the chair, and he had I don't know, I can't remember what you would call them, but basically just wires that would wrap around your fingertips, and then he would start adjusting the dials, and then he used a rub plate, which you can tell our audience when I'm done with this anecdote what a rub plate is, and he could with that he could diagnose just very quickly just what part of you was hurting, why it was hurting, and how to take care of it.
Now, do you ask it questions, or do you write it down and put it on the black box?
There's a couple of ways to approach it. One way is that there's all like published worksheets that, like, there's a soil and plant analysis sheet that has frequencies or radionic rates that are known to vibrate and resonate with particular physical characteristics, and then also just like what you think of elements off of the chemical chart, as far as again, calcium and ammonium and that sort of thing. So that's one way, is you could go through the sheet and take a reading of general vitality and say, well, here's the overall energetic strength of this plant or this field, and now let's look at these things that we know should be a part of every healthy plant or animal, same way. And if those things that are low, again, we can take action either in the physical octave or by broadcasting some energy back through the instrument.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember years ago, I met a fellow by the name of Cleve Baxter. Are you familiar with his work? He hooked up lie detector, polygraph machine to plants, and found out that they actually could sustain pain, and that if people were thinking negative about them, in some cases they would even wilt over and die. So, I mean, it seems that there is something in the etheric here that promotes the use of something like this. Now, is there anything that you could tell us that the Hieronymus machine cannot do?
Well, the Hieronymus instrument is not a diagnosis tool. It really is not a replacement for modern medicine by a licensed professional. So those are terms that I actually you'd never hear me using, like treat, cure, and diagnose. We had two guys in suits made a very nice visit to us in the mid '80s and from the FDA, and made it very plain that those words belong to them. And so that's fine. We just always talk in terms of energy, which is really what it is. It's subtle energy. The subtle energy feels related. The real thing is that, even high school chemistry, at that level, they tell you, well, at that level, at the atomic level or the subatomic level, everything is energy and vibration. And it's the particular frequency of that vibration that determines whether those atoms appear to us as a banana or as a piece of wood or as the cat that's, sitting in my lap here. And so if we can just find those resonant frequencies to tune into those things, we can gather that information and then again make that broadcast to increase that energy, cause it to resonate more strongly, where natural healing will occur on its own. It's very Eastern in that regard. And likewise, if it's something that we want rid of, like a pest or a unhealthy disease energy, we can send a dissonant frequency that's going to cause that to dissipate, lower the strength of that energy. But it really is all energy. One thing you hit on, though, that's sort of the real analytical way, the real scientific approach to it. There's also the whole school of just using your instrument. Just like if you're we're in our hometown, we know what radio station we go to for the sports scores or the classical music or whatever it is we're in the mood for. But if we're in a strange town, we just hunt through the dial. And in the same way that Jim was talking about, you can use your focused intent to lock onto a particular pattern of resonance that isn't going to be on a worksheet or in the book. You're just cold scanning through those dials to find a pattern of resonance with a new idea or something that you haven't been able to identify.
Well, how many dials are on the box, and is each box unique, or are they constructed differently?
No, they're all built the same. They're all built on the basic Hieronymus tuning model, which is a 2-dial system. It's the predominant system in North America, which is where you have a left-hand dial and a right-hand dial, and then you've got a volume knob to assess, how much strength there is to a particular frequency. A particular instrument might have more banks so that you can add more frequencies, basically to build chords instead of just having one note. You could build a whole symphony of information and make that broadcast together.
Well, now when you say broadcast, where does this information appear? Is there a screen on the device, or?
No, and this is really where you do get into the sensitivity of the operator, because the interface is really the rub plate that you mentioned, or the rub plate or the reaction plate, which is actually the output antenna for the system. At its very simplest level, it's a 2-wire loop of coil, twisted in the middle to turn it into a Mobius coil. At the most complex, like our fancier ones, are based on Tesla's 1894 bifluor coil antenna patent.
And Tesla, there you go.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's where you get to the good stuff, is because really it was just a low power radio until you get to that antenna. And the core idea of it is it's a scalar antenna, which means the directional components. You've got, like all your energy workers will tell you, that with clockwise motion you're adding energy to a circuit or pushing energy into a being, and then with counterclockwise you're releasing a pattern and letting it go. It's just the same lefty loosey, righty tighty. And by having those two coils, clockwise and counterclockwise, directly on top of each other or directly adjacent to each other, the directional components cancel out and leave only the energy. And it's my theory that this 3D realm that we think of as reality doesn't know what to do with putting those clockwise and counterclockwise elements side by side, and opens a portal back to the energetic realm from which all things flow.
Well, Tim, now you did a book which has been a ongoing bestseller, The Lost Journals of Nikola Tesla. Did you find anything similar in your research on Nikola?
Well, definitely. But I mean, this is the kind of research that took place, after Tesla passed away. Using his theories. I mean, some of the stuff that he was working on while he was still alive was heading in that direction. But you have to remember that Tesla, he was the type of guy that if he would get bored with something, he would move on to his next big love, and leave that kind of stuff behind. But definitely. I mean, the things that Tesla was working on were then later taken by people like Bob Hieronymus, and they were the ones who really ran with it.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. Well, Tesla, you don't have to go too deep into Tesla before you hear these ideas of wireless transmission of information, and which, of course, now they say he really was the first one to discover radio and nail that down, but also wireless transmission of power. And it was these scalar relationships. That's another term that he invented, is the idea of a scalar broadcast. That's a Tesla term, and he's the big godfather of the whole thing.
Well, plus in the 1920s, Tesla worked with several different companies creating machines that were supposed to heal various ailments, which may have been like some of the precursors of the modern day radionics. Of course, Tesla also worked with like ultraviolet and infrared types of machines as well. So I mean, some people have gotten those mixed up with some of these other ideas that Tesla had about various kinds of electromagnetic radiation being able to resonate with the human body and to heal. And I use that word. Sorry, FDA.
Well, they only listen to the first hour of the programs.
There you go. Well, and we hear that voice getting ready to come up here, Tim. So we need to go to our top of the hour break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation about dowsing and radionics and more on Exploring the Bizarre.
Exploring the Bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, welcome back to the second hour of Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz, and tonight we're talking about dowsing and radionics and everything, hopefully everything that's related to these subjects with our guests, Jim Willis and Ed Kelly. And so, Jim, will ask you here now, people, when they think of dowsing, I think that probably a lot of people think back to, the farmer walking across the field with a forked willow stick, looking for water. But really, I mean, there's if somebody knows what they're doing, they can use just about anything and look for just about anything and answer just about anything.
Yeah, I like to use the metaphor of light. We live in a range of light where we see red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And we think that is the color structure. We have learned, since we have all these high-tech instruments and things like what Ed is doing, and Dean Radin's work at the Noetic Institute out in California, and the Monroe Institute up here in our neck of the woods. What we've learned, of course, through all the scientific procedures is that the little narrow band of light that we see goes way on up and way on down. We're just not aware of it. Now, that light registers on us. We just, our five senses have evolved in this particular climate, this particular landscape. Our five senses have evolved, and they've to do something that they do very well, and that's to help us relate to the world as it appears around us. What science is showing us now, especially in the terms of quantum reality, is that we are living what we think is real is really an illusion. And what the narrow band that we experience and are able to identify is a very narrow band of reality. What dowsing does is open up that whole band and show us that there's a whole lot more going on that our bodies are aware of, but over the long course of our evolution, our senses have started to filter those out. Just take, for instance, an electroencephalogram. Everybody knows about the EEGs. Mm-hmm. We know that in the everyday world in which we live, in the beta range, and you'll have to kind of make sure I'm on the right thing here. In the beta range, we show those kinds of figures. Our brains are acting in the beta range of 12 to 30 hertz. If we go to a meditative state, we move into what they call the alpha range, the low frequency band, which is 7.5 to 12 hertz. And if we go even deeper than that into what some people call the transcendental experience, the experience of the mystic, the experience of the out-of-body traveler and everything else, now we're into the theta range where our brains are actually dealing with 4 to 7 hertz and putting out that kind of range. And in deep sleep and in some psychic healers, they move into the delta range, the super low frequencies below that. Now, are we aware of all those ranges of EEG waves? No, not unless we measure them. In our lives, we just have really no use for them in a practical experience. It's only when we begin to move out of that and move into these different states that we can begin to really dig into feeling what's going around us. And I've often said, this sounds maybe a little hard to say. I don't mean to be at all negative here, but I've often said I just can't wait to die, because all of a sudden I will be freed from those five senses. And I've had a few experiences, well, quite a few experiences of being able to experience reality outside of the range of those five senses. And it's such a bigger world of reality out there. My wife Barb refers to it, this narrow range here, as our perception realm. This is what we perceive. On the outside of that perception realm, there is a huge world of reality out there. And that's the world of reality I think that we're talking about now.
Well, to me, that only makes sense because think about it. I mean, we have our senses that, they evolved for us to live in this physical world, to watch out for that tiger hiding behind that bush that's going to jump out and possibly eat us. And if we actually did become aware of everything else that's around us, it would probably drive us crazy.
I was going to say we'd probably go mad. We really would. And so in that sense, we can't say that I often in the past have referred to the senses as our prison, and we have to break out of the prison of the five senses. But I just don't like to talk about it in those terms anymore. I think more they are a blessing rather than a curse. I think they literally keep us from going mad. One of the, I don't want to dominate too much here, but one of the great ideas in quantum reality is Hugh Everett's idea, which he came with back in the 50s, called the many world thesis of the many, multi-universe, the megaverse and all that kind of thing. When Hugh talked about this, he tried to talk about person making a decision, and we would make a decision. And he said, when we make that decision, the world splits. Both possibilities actually come into being. And now we have two of us living in two parallel worlds. And each one thinks that they're alone. And the only one who can see them is the person who had the original thought. But then those two people make a measurement or make a choice. And now all of a sudden we have four of us living in four separate worlds, each thinking we're alone. And then it goes on to 8, and then it goes on to 16. If we were aware of quantum physics talk about of collapsing energy, the energy that Ed was talking about. It collapses into various forms. Like Ed said so beautifully, it may collapse into the form of a banana or into the form of a cat. If we were aware of all of the potential coming out of what Ervin Laszlo calls the Akashic field, the field of potentiality, if we were aware of all that, we would probably literally go mad. So we have to be careful. We have to learn how to swim in these waters. But when we do, it's an exciting time.
One man whose life was greatly affected by this is the late science fiction author Philip K. Dick. In fact, we did a book that's been out for, I guess a month or so now. He believed that we were actually living in in the Matrix, and that at any one time we could actually be residing in a multitude of dimensions and other levels of reality. And he even had incidences where he claims, Tim, right, that he had met and spoken with aliens, but even more so, he remembered exactly specific lifetimes that he had lived or was living simultaneously, where he knew even the language of the that period, even though supposedly he could have not known it. I mean, he wasn't educated to know it. He was not linguistically, trained in any way. He was a remarkable man in that way. And of course, people, especially in the science fiction community, totally poo-pooed his theories and his ideas, which they do to a very large extent with anybody who comes up with any new concept. That's why I'm kind of astonished that Joseph Campbell would put so much stock in radionics and dowsing, because if you take the history of the science fiction fandom in this country, they all follow their masters and leaders like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, who just say that all of this is a total fraud and a total fallacy.
Yeah, and I don't think it's the science fiction people now who are really talking about this as much as it is the scientists. I mean, we're talking about real scientists who are dealing with these ideas in a very real way, and to a certain extent, they're having to pay the price of being the first. But it's pretty fantastic. The words of the prophet come now not from the mystic, but from the halls of science.
Now, yeah, I totally agree. It's so amazing to have ideas like quantum entanglement on the headlines of major newspapers.
Yeah,
an idea that I've been hearing about since I was a little kid. And it's funny, Jim. I love that idea. And what you were saying before, Tim, if there's infinite realms of infinite possibility, and where we are here in this mobile meat box is nothing but a matrix of illusion, then it really goes back to that. When you go to the film version, there really is no spoon. You really can manifest almost anything if you can really tap in at that level. And even though I agree, I think this narrow bandwidth helps us keep our bearings within this realm, each and every one of us has that God-given ability to go into a state of prayer or a wish, or even in the popular books recently of like The Secret and What the Bleep Are We Doing, all of those, they're all that same elephant of being able to manifest a reality out of those infinite possibilities to go where we want it to.
Which, if you take it one step farther, actually leads to a purpose. We ask the question, why are we here? What is our purpose? And perhaps our purpose is to experience literally everything. And to have a physical experience of virtually everything that can happen, in which case the multiverse makes perfect sense. And someday, when we're done with this life, we take all of this experience that we've accumulated and we return to the source. And when we do, having experienced all these different lives, having experienced all these different things that happen to us, we are literally understanding what it is to be not only one, but also individuality within that one. Because the only way to experience individuality is to be, in effect, separate from the source, cut off from the source. And so we feel cut off from the source. But as we begin to douse, as we begin to meditate, as we begin to learn these things, we begin to understand that we are not really cut off from the source. We really are one. I guess we're getting a little metaphysical here, but it's a fascinating concept.
All right. Well, now here's a question, and both gentlemen, both of you can answer this if you have any knowledge at it. But has anybody actually ever tried using radionics or dowsing to detect some of these other universes, other realities, especially those that are probably parallel ours fairly close?
Tim, every day, every day. I have a spirit guide who I found through dowsing, and he affects my dowsing rods by when I hold them out, they don't cross. They both turn to the right. It was just absolutely amazing to me to be able to realize that there is a real entity, a being that I probably can't understand, who is in a separate dimension, who is just as anxious to contact me as I am to contact him. And
now, has he identified himself?
Yes, yeah. When I started having out-of-body experiences, I gradually, through a long time, and using my dowsing rods, yes or no questions, I have a name simply will not go away, and the name is Sobuko. I don't think that's his name, and I don't know what I look like, but it's the name that I have to use because it's the name that somehow expresses itself. I'd like to say I know what he looks like, but I probably don't, because when you go out of body, you come back and your mind has to explain it. So your mind jumps through your Rolodex of experiences and picks something that is close. So I can't say this is what it is. All I can say is this is what it is like. But this presence has been so real in my life that the book I'm working right now is called Sobuko and Me. It's a story of contact through in the Akashic field through extra dimension. Now, in a way, I used to hate to talk about this kind of thing because people immediately think you're crazy. But I am a rational left brain, scientific, rational thinker. And I have discovered this relatively late in my life, and I simply can't keep quiet about it because I'm absolutely convinced if the collective mind of humankind can move outside of our own narrow little band and begin to see the possibilities out there, I think it could really change the way we live on this earth.
Well, a French author by the name of Amy Michel wrote a book many, many years ago. It was called, I believe, Flying Saucers in the Straight Line Mystery. Mm-hmm. And he talked about these energy points, many of which were at a total straight line. And there were a lot of UFO sightings and contacts taking place along these ley lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't doubt it. The energies that are there are, when Ed talked about entanglement, the energies that are there are moving through our dimension, but they also exist in other dimensions. Now, we've found, I think, just within the last year, we have found one of the barriers that separates us from another dimension, and it's called the Higgs field. Energy passes through the Higgs field and takes on mass, so to speak. It's almost as if we have discovered one of the fences, so to speak, that fence us in our particular material world. What's on the other side of the Higgs field? Well, we don't know. Where does the energy come from? We don't know. Where does it go? We don't know. But it's there, and I think we're just beginning to see the how this is all going to affect us.
Jim,
And
you and I are going to have to go out on tour together after this is over because.
Oh, let's do it.
Everything you're saying, it's just so perfectly complementary. And, I can offer an example from the radionic side that, he was talking about being able to reach across through those dimensions and communicate with an actual conscious being and share wisdom and knowledge back and forth. And then kind of in a whole nother angle, but still equally crossing those boundaries was like something, again, we do on a regular basis, which is the idea that that time is a singularity and it's not a linear thing at all. It only exists in a linear form in this 3D realm.
Yeah.
And so it's often the case that a pattern of information that plagues somebody as far as how they feel in this life might actually be because of something that happened, some kind of terrible trauma to an ancestor way back in time, or a descendant out forward in time. And so that sometimes the broadcast needs to be directed backwards or forward, what we think of as backwards or forwards, but in fact is all one and all reflections of the exact same creature, that you are your grandfather.
Yeah. Isn't that fascinating that it's the quantum physicists who are now starting to say that time can move backwards and a future can affect the past. I think that's a tremendous insight, Ed. I really do.
It's an exciting time. I really agree.
Okay, now how would you even detect something like that? I mean, it can be confusing enough trying to determine what's going on in the present, but then when you're starting to get into the whole idea that time is just kind of an eternal now. You've got influences like you said, coming from the past and future, and then from possibly parallel realities as well. I mean, how can you weed that all out?
It's not an accident that Einstein referred to the time-space continuum, time and space, our space, literally our material world. They are very much connected, and when we move out of this material world let's say in meditation or contacting through dowsing or some of the other psychic phenomena that is being studied now, when we move out of there, all of a sudden we enter into strange realities. And I think that people have been doing this for as long as there have been people, but they describe it in different ways. And it depends on their culture. For instance, in Ireland, they might see leprechauns. In Native American cultures, they might see different kinds of beings, or they might see fairies, or perhaps even a lot of what we talk about in terms of space alien influence. Could that be that what we are really detecting and what we consider alien contact with us is really not through nuts and bolts spaceships, but through literally extra-dimensional beings that are real. They're just as real as us. And probably if we were to go over there and you were to talk to them and say, do you know that those people back where I came from are real entities? They'd probably think you were crazy too, because we all have the idea that we are living in our own little bubble, and our own little bubble is all that there is. I just don't think that's the way it is at all.
I agree completely. I've always believed that that it's not a spacecraft flying across the light years, but I think the vast majority of them are transdimensional. It's a grand unifying theory of everything from Sasquatch to UFOs. It really makes so much more sense than trying to rationalize the other.
What I'll add, talking about UFOs, because that's always a favorite subject with Tim Beckley and myself. I mean, has anybody attempted to use like a radionics device to delve into that mystery?
Oh, absolutely. There's been, usually what you see most often is people trying to create an interaction or a visitation by pumping, the thing that sets an instrument apart, a radionic instrument apart from just a simple making a wish or saying a prayer, we turn that focused intent back in on an idea and we send this little bolt of energy out. But then, I'm only 5 seconds into it before my mind zips off to what we're having for lunch or whatever else I've got to do in the day. But the instrument, you could find a resonant frequency that sings with that idea, and then turn on the amplifier, and then it acts as a repeating station all day long while you do other things. And so people will set up, and it's a funny thing. You mentioned the UFOs. The very first printing of my father's book, the one that ended up, that's why the guys from the FDA came to see us, is because in his naivete, he had put treat, cure, and diagnose all through that book. And once we got those words out of there, they were fine. But that very first book did have a rate or a radionic frequency to call UFOs. That's how it was labeled in the book. I was fascinated with that idea. Growing up in a household like this, I thought the coolest thing ever would be to go for a ride in a spacecraft. And so one day, without them really knowing about it, I had an instrument to play with as a teenager, and I had it set to that rate to call UFOs. And a few days into it, my dad happened to be right there, and he said, "Hey, what have you got set on the instrument?" And I said, "Oh, it's this call UFOs rate."
All right, Ed, I'm gonna stop you here, and we'll leave this at a cliffhanger because we have to go to our break. We'll be right back, and we'll continue the UFO story in just a few minutes.
We're gonna call UFOs when we come back.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, before we went to our break, Ed Kelly was telling us a story about his attempt to look for a UFO. So, Ed, why don't you continue that story for us?
Yeah, so there I was. I was a teenager at the time, and I found this rate in the rate book for call UFOs, and so I had that set on one of the instruments, and happened to be in the office there at the same time as my dad, and he asked what I had set on the instrument, and I told him, "Oh, it's that call UFOs rate. I want to go for a ride." And the color drained out of his face in such a way that I had never seen in the whole rest of my years with him. I'd never seen just a pure reaction of, really, he looked horrified. And he reached right over and shut it off and said, "Don't ever do that again." And I really was quite taken aback. I'd never seen anything like that. And the funny thing is, that rate disappeared before it ever got to the second printing. It was just a little test run right at the beginning, and it was completely gone from the book. And, of course, I wasn't paying that close attention at the time. I thought it's in the book. So I don't know what that rate is. I really don't. We could cold scan for a new one, but I don't know what that rate was. And I'd love to have a few minutes. He's gone now, but I'd give anything to have a few minutes with him about where that rate came from and why he looked so frightened. But I'll tell you, after he passed away, my sister, Erin, who's my partner in the business, she revealed something I had never realized or heard before, which was that he never turned the lights off. He slept with the lights on every night of the week. And I really believe it had something to do with whatever that UFO rate was all about.
We worked with a fellow for many years. He lived in Santa Barbara, California, Bill Cox. He was the editor of the Pyramid Guide, and he traveled all over the world with his dowsing rods, and met with really some spectacular people who had some really uncanny abilities. In fact, there were contactees that he became friends with, and they had the ability to actually disappear in front of people's eyes. And wow. in the book, I think it's called "The Pyramid Speaks" that we reprinted recently. There are actual photographs of these individuals. Now, some of them actually claim that they were, part extraterrestrial, but they did have the uncanny ability to dematerialize and then materialize once again. And he was a perfectly sincere and honest person, and he did a lot of research on this. That was probably the first person that I knew that was involved in dowsing. Isn't there a national dowsing organization? Is that in New Hampshire? Vermont.
Well, that's where the headquarters of the American Dowsing Association is. Also, there's of course the British Dowsers are. Our British Dowsing Association is a huge organization of dowsers as well. Matter of fact, that's where a mentor who I never met, Hamish Miller, the great beloved British dowser, was very active in the British Dowsing Association. I didn't get a chance to meet Hamish, but I was invited to go to Cornwall a couple of years ago and give a talk to the parallel community, which Hamish Miller started. And I gave a talk on the basics of world religions. And while I was there, I had quite a chance to spend some time with Bob Miller, who was Hamish's wife, and wonderful, wonderful lady, who used to tell me about how Hamish used to come back so frustrated sometimes and throw the dowsing rods in a corner and everything else. So even the best of us used to have tough days. But there are some wonderful dowsing organizations, and of course the American Dowsing Association that I belong to is one of the best around here. I mean, certainly the biggest in this country.
Now, Jim, during one of our breaks, we were talking about using dowsing to, look into haunted houses and places like that. You said that you had a story or some stories that you could tell us.
Yeah, I had an experience that, quite frankly, I don't even know how to handle it. But I had a neighbor call me up one day, and she said, "Can I come over and talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." So she came over, and she said, "My son and his wife and their young child are living at our house right now because they are convinced that their house where they were living was haunted." And I said, "Well, what makes them think that?" And I'm thinking, "Oh boy, here we go," that kind of thing. And she said, "Well, there were noises and there were things happening, and they just didn't feel that the energy there was right, and they were frankly afraid with their little child, so they came over here." And I said, "Well, tell me where the house is, and can you give me an address?" And so she did, and I Googled it and found out where it was. And I said, "Can you draw me a picture of the house? Inside, just a rough diagram of the inside of the house." And she brought it over, and I saw where it was on the computer, and I was looking at her picture and dowsing it, and I was getting all kinds of strange readings. I had never done anything like this before. I'd read about it, but I didn't know quite what to make of it. So I said, "Can we go there?" And she said, "Sure." So my wife and my neighbor and I went over there on a Saturday morning. And there was this house, looked perfectly normal house. And as I walked around it with my dowsing rods, I discovered that there were two very strong energy lines that met in that crossed right there. Now, whenever that happens with energy lines, you usually wind up with a huge vortex of energy, a very energetic space. So I knew that something was going on in the house, and we went on inside. And by asking questions, is somebody here, and looking through the rooms and dowsing and finding out where the energy is. Over the course of asking many, many questions and really intending it all, we discovered that there were two presences in the house which we just simply could not understand. One of them was female and one of them was male. And by talking to them, a very tragic story came out. And again, this is only a matter of questioning. It's a long, involved process. Are you here? Are we in touch with you? Is this real? Can you tell us your story? When did you live? It turned out through this long period of questioning that there was a white woman who lived in this house, and she had an affair with a black man back in the old days of Jim Crow. And it was found out, and the black man was actually, he was one of the last black people to be hung in this particular place. And since their death, in this vortex, the two have come together, and we're very happy for the first time. So what are we going to do, like The Exorcist, and cast them out? No, of course not. You're happy? Yeah, okay. Knock yourself out. Just don't break the furniture, that kind of thing. And we have since been able to verify this story historically. It's just amazing to me. And yet, why is it that we have such a hard time believing that our souls, our essence, which are simply manifestations of energy, why is it that they can't leave an energetic trace, an energetic trail in a particular place that is very meaningful to them? And apparently in this vortex where these two lines cross, was a very comfortable place for them. I almost, like I say, almost hesitate to tell these stories to people, because for much of my life I wouldn't have ever believed any of this stuff, and yet I've seen too many things now to realize that there's a lot going on out there that we just don't know.
Yeah, I have a friend I've known for years, and she works and has worked for a number of different police departments over the years, finding missing people, bodies, like tossed guns, things like that. And her technique is that she will take a map, like a physical map, and she will move her finger over the map, and with her other hand, with her right hand, she will rub the table. And,
okay.
Yes.
Most this is very common. Most police departments use these all the time. They just don't tell people.
Right.
They don't want to affect their funding, I suppose. Most people will use a pendulum, but they'll do the same thing. They'll rub their finger over the map and watch where the pendulum works.
She at times she will use the pendulum as well, but she says that a lot of times that she will get a better reading if from the stick method, and she just uses her fingers on the table, and she's been very, very successful at it. But you were talking about the crisscrossing of the vortexes over this house. I know I was reading a book years ago that were talking about a lot of the megalith sites, especially in England, and how a lot of those have not just two of these energy lines crossing underneath them, but like multiple ones.
Yeah.
And practically every one of the the major megaliths had numerous vortex lines.
Yeah, and as you cross onto them, I've had a chance to douse a few when I was over in England. When you cross onto them, for instance, the Merry Maidens in Cornwall was a very famous site. You will find an 8-fold grid that goes in a circle around this, and you will find 8 definite energy lines, one flowing clockwise, the next counterclockwise, then clockwise, and so on. And they're only a couple of inches apart. And it almost seems as if this grid turns on, so to speak, the site. And we didn't know anything about this when my wife and I built our medicine wheel here in South Carolina. And we wanted a pathway around it. And so I didn't know anything about dowsing at the time. But we built this medicine wheel, and we just did what felt right. And lo and behold, when I learned to dowse and when I began to do more dowsing down there, we discovered that somehow we had been either led by some spiritual force or forced by the energy in nature itself to replicate this. And we found that 8-fold grid on our medicine wheel. And we found many different lines going out from it. And I've dowsed some of those lines with a compass and dowsing rods out as much as a mile or two. And find ancient stone piles or find ancient rock places of tools or something like that on these lines. So I think our ancestors were very much in tune with this. I think we've allowed their abilities to atrophy. So we need to use dowsing rods and high-tech machines where they would just be following instinct. And I think this is something that in the human race we have lost this ability, and maybe it's beginning to be born again. I'm hoping so in our generation.
Well, now, okay, Ed.
Yeah.
For somebody who is, say, listening to this program and is now interested in learning about radionics and maybe taking it up, what would you what's your recommendations? What would you say to somebody who has never done anything like this before? How to get started?
There's a couple really great pathways. One, there's a book by a guy named Duncan Laurie called Radionics: The Secret Art. And Duncan's a neat guy because he's a fine artist in the term of sculptor, painter kind of a guy. And his whole book, which covers the history of radionics, it goes to Abrams, Hieronymus, the Europeans like Ruth Drown. It covers all of those topics in the way of not an engineer and not a metaphysicist, but in that fine artist approach. So that's a great introduction to the history of the field. There's a radionics Facebook group where there's lively discussion with people using all kinds of instruments from all around the world, very old instruments to people that are making their own stuff to this day for very inexpensively. So that's a great community hub. Certainly the U.S. Psychotronics Association is still going strong. That group was mainly founded by a group of radionics guys, but they wanted to make a bigger umbrella, make a bigger tent to also cover the other paranormal and mind matter phenomena such as psychic abilities and so on. And the USPA is interesting because they really are focused on what's the science, how does this work. If you go to our own website at kellyresearchtech.com, there's a books page, a books link, and if you go to the bottom, there's a whole bunch of free books, historical volumes, and then like our own book, which really even lays out not only the theories and techniques, but really step by step, literally, if you bought or used one of these instruments, how you would set the dials, when to throw the switch, how to do the testing at a very basic level, so that to take as much of the woo-woo out of it and make it into a practical tool. So those are some great starting places. Psychotronics.org is the USPA. They have a meeting once a year. This will be their 40th meeting. They missed a couple since '74, but this will be their 40th annual meeting. And then probably the Facebook group and then Duncan Laurie's group. Those are great introductions. And you can always come to a workshop, put your hands right on an instrument and see for yourself if you get that reaction. That stick that you were talking about on the tabletop, all we're doing is boosting that electronically to make that signal easier to find for somebody who's maybe just getting in touch with those gifts for the first time. And it's funny, if you don't mind my saying so, it's a part that has always, for decades, was one of the worst elements of talking about radionics with the mainstream world, because you had this okay, so you're going to rub on a plate and it's going to tell you secrets, and it sounds crazy, just like you were saying, Jim. But it turns out there really was, 4 years after the Hieronymus patent, Hieronymus described how to build a rub plate and how to use it, but he couldn't explain why it worked. And 4 years later, an engineer named Mattelroot published in the journal Science, one of the most prestigious scientific journals, an explanation of how that worked. And it really is just as simple. If you have an insulating surface, and then you have either an ultrasonic or an electrical field on the other side of that surface, that we as bioelectric creatures can sense the changing strength of that field. And it's the exact same technology that gives us our capacitance touchscreen cell phones that we all have in our pockets these days, where in that case the computer senses that you have changed the capacitance by introducing your bioelectric field. But with the instrument, it's the opposite. The signal changes as you turn the dials, and then it's up to you to detect that change that you sense as a stick or a tingle, or some people even actually hear it as this high-pitched change in the static.
Wow. Okay, and Jim, now what about somebody who would be interested in getting started in dowsing? Who's never done it before, maybe listening to the program. What would you tell them?
First of all, get on your computer and look for the American Society of Dowsers website. They've got all kinds of helps, and they tell you about where to find people in your area that might be able to help, and about meetings and conference calls and that kind of thing. And they answer a lot of questions. They have a lot of articles there. And also, if you want to see a basic video of it, if you go to my website, jimwillis.net, and one of the things there, I think it's About Us, or one of those books or something, I'm not sure which category it is, has a YouTube video that I did at the American Society of Dowsers last June. It's about an hour and a half long, and it talks about some of the same things we talked about today, but it's a video that'll get you started. And I you can't go wrong. The other thing is the book that I just published had published a couple of months ago, Supernatural Gods, Spiritual Mysteries, Psychic Experiences, and Scientific Truths. It's published by Visible Ink Press. You can find it on Amazon. If you just look Jim Willis, Supernatural Gods, you'll get a whole bunch of websites, places that sell it and all that kind of thing. And there are some chapters in there about dowsing and about these interdimensional things that we've been talking about. And all of those together, I think, will get you a good start.
Yeah, that's a great book, by the way, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. Well, okay. Do you? And I know everybody is different, but I mean, do you think that most people would respond more readily to say like an L rod rather than trying the traditional fork willow stick?
Well, in my case, I do. I've never been able to make a willow stick work. I've seen people do it. I've never been able to do it. L rods, to me, have been the most convenient. When I teach people how to dowse, for instance, and shows what change, I'll even take someone and we'll dowse the aura of a tree. We'll find a tree out here and we'll dowse the aura and find out that tree has an aura that goes out 3-4 feet. Then we'll go back and we'll literally hug the tree and let that tree know that it's loved. And then we'll dowse the aura again. And the second time, after we have interacted with that tree in a physical way, the aura now will go out 15, 16 feet sometimes. Wow. It's just amazing how plants can respond. And this is not really that far out. People have been saying for generations that some people have a green thumb. They can talk to their plants. The plants respond. I believe they do. We're all one in this connected matrix, and I think we can communicate in this way. When Ed was talking about calling for the aliens, it makes perfect sense. You put out a machine. It's a beacon. We did the very same thing when we sent out the spacecraft, the Voyager spacecraft, and Carl Sagan came up with this clever thing to try to communicate with somebody out there. Well, out there is a pretty vast area, and what Ed was doing with his was contacting someone who was a whole lot closer instead of being miles away, being a thought away, a dimension away, and a whole lot closer than we think.
All right, gentlemen. We've only got about 3 minutes left in the program, so I want to give both of you a chance to let our listeners know a little bit more about you, where they can find out more about you. Ed, let's start first. What's your website again?
The website is kellyresearchtech.com. It's the company, as you said it at the beginning, it started as Interdimensional Sciences and Dimensional Sciences. And after Dad passed away, the lawyers told us we were be well advised to pick a new name and proceed under that umbrella. So we've been Kelly Research Technology since 2006, and we've been building and selling radionic instruments since 1978. And we teach workshops and go out around the country. And actually, I just found out I'm going to be teaching my first workshop in Australia in August. So I'm super excited about that.
Oh, fantastic! And what will you be teaching in Australia?
Just the literal basics of how to set the instrument, how to put a sample in the well, how to take readings, how to do the cold scanning, and how to make a balancing broadcast to either add energy to something that you want more of or reduce the level of energy in something you want less of.
So there are people all over the world who are experimenting and researching this.
Absolutely. We literally ship all over the world, and these are tools that are used by all of the major governments. It's a quiet thing that goes on.
CIA?
No, I would never.
Never tell us that. Yeah, who knows? Yeah, they wouldn't tell you anyway. Yeah.
Well, Hieronymus quite famously got his first big government contract by. He called up his old buddies from the Army and said, "Hey, I bet I can tell you the vital signs of the Gemini astronauts while they're in orbit." Wow. And they said, "All right, you're on." And the next thing you know, he was in business.
Big contract. I see it coming now.
All right, Jim. Real quick, what's your website again?
The website is jimwillis.net or on Facebook at jimwillis.author.
And don't forget our Facebook channel. It's Mr. UFO's Secret Files, with almost 200 videos and interviews and everything you wanted to know about any of these topics. You'll find up there. And do join us next week, same time, same station. And thank you, Tina, and thank you, Tim, and thank you, Peter, and our guests for tonight, and Helen and Carol, and everyone who helps us put this on the air. And God bless all our listeners.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.